Well, good morning. It's been a good morning together. Hope that you have been uplifted by our time together. A couple of things that we need to discuss before we get started. So, we sang this song about how we are the body of Christ. We're going to have a few opportunities here to celebrate that unity, to celebrate this, to celebrate being a part of this body. The first is tonight. We are going to have a time of fellowship together. We're going to have our chili cook-off. So plan on being here at 5 o'clock tonight for the chili cook-off. Bring your chili, bring your games, bring your sides, and if you don't have anything to bring, just bring yourself. Yes, everyone has to come. This is a mandatory event. Attendance will be taken. So yes, please come for that. It'll be a great time of unity and fellowship. Next week, as I told the class this morning, you are not invited to come to church here. We are closing the doors here, and we're going to be having the Kanawha Valley Unity Service, which will be at West Virginia State University. So plan on being there. That will be at 10 o'clock. That will be a time of worship and praise and a time for us to just have fellowship with some of the area congregations, some other people who share in this one faith that we all have together, who are also part of this one body. And so be there at 10 o'clock, West Virginia State University. If you need a ride or if you need help getting there or whatever it might be, see me, see one of the elders. They could probably help you as well. But please make it a point to be there. That will be a good time for all and certainly an uplifting time. So be sure to be there, and just remember, if you come here, you're probably not going to find anybody here except for other people who are just looking for other people to be here, if that makes sense. I'm not for sure that I know what I just said. So anyway, that being said, let's get into our topic this morning. We've been in the book of Luke together. It hasn't necessarily been my intention to preach a series of sermons from Luke. It just happened to work out that way. Which is why we've kind of been taking them from bits and pieces all over the place. We have been studying the book of Luke in our Sunday morning class with the adults, and just the more that I study it, the more that we talk about it and we dive into it, the more I just fall in love with Luke's gospel and fall in love with this message. And so there keeps coming more and more things that I want to talk about from Luke. So we are in Luke chapter 6 this morning. Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 49, we have kind of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. There is some debate as to whether this is the Sermon on the Mount as what is presented in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, or if this is something different, but it's my belief that this is the same thing. This is just Luke's condensed version of it. And so we have in Luke chapter 6, Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount, and it looks a little bit like the version in Matthew. It's just condensed. And so in Luke chapter 6, beginning at verse 29 through 49, we read this sermon. And it starts off with the Beatitudes as we've come to know them. They're not as exhaustive as what we find in Matthew, but we have some blessings and we have some woes. Then Jesus moves to talk about having a love for your enemies. After speaking on that a little bit, and it's within that section that he gives us that golden rule to do to others as you would have them do to you. That's verse 31. Then he moves from that and he begins to talk about judging others and what that looks like. Then he talks about a tree being known by its fruit, and then he closes out this message with the story of the wise and the foolish builders that we talked about a few weeks ago. And so I want to look at this story, or I want to look at this section together. I want to look specifically at these verses that were read for us earlier. You see, right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, in Luke's version, he gives us this parable that Jesus tells. Luke chapter 6, verses 39 through 40, it says, he also told them this parable. Now, remember, a parable is it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's Jesus using earthly things that we understand to get across this bigger point that he wants us to understand, that he wants us to grasp about what it means to live within the kingdom of God. And so in verses 39 through 40, it says that he told them this parable. He says, can the blind lead the blind? He's expecting a no answer from that. He says, can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? And then he says, the student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. I love this little parable that he tells. But I want us to ask the question is just, what exactly is it doing here? Why is it that Jesus chooses in this moment to tell this short little parable about blind people leading blind people and how they're going to fall into a pit, and about a student and a teacher and how the student's not to be above the teacher, but rather as the student becomes fully trained, he will become like the teacher. And I want us to talk about this passage for a few moments and see maybe what the point is that Jesus is trying to get across to us. I've kind of gone back and forth on how to illustrate this, and here's how I want to do that. So this, over the course of the past couple of weeks, Avery has been coming home with some test grades. You see, he's in first grade now. He's finally getting tested. He's getting letter grades. He has homework, and we have to study with him. When he was in kindergarten, he either passed or he failed, but there really weren't any, quote-unquote grades. But now in first grade, he has spelling words. He has things that he has to read. He has to learn how to write. And a couple of weeks ago, while I was out of town, he had his first test. They have their test every Thursday. And so Thursday afternoon, or all that week, he had been studying his spelling words. And he has about 10 spelling words each week. And so Thursday afternoon, he comes home, he gets off the bus, and from what Erica tells me, he just has this big smile on his face. He's all excited, and he's running off the bus to go and see Erica. And when he gets there, he pulls out his spelling test, and he says, "Look, Mommy, I got a 100A." And the teacher, of course, had given him a 100%. He'd got every spelling word correct. She'd even written across, "Great job, Avery." And we were thinking that's great. We were proud of him. And Avery has been, I have to brag him a little bit, he's been doing really well on his tests, and for the most part, he's getting all these answers correct, and we're just really proud of him. And each time he brings home his test, and he's all excited, and it says, "Good job," across the top. But I want you to consider for just a moment that maybe he didn't get a 100%. Maybe he failed. Almost like, all right, Ben's treating this like confession time. We're not going to get into that. We also are not going to get into my grades. Anyway, so I'll tell you about that later. So imagine for a moment that Avery has these 10 spelling words that he has to come home and he has to learn. And for the whole week, we are going over these words, and we feel just absolutely confident that he knows all of them. We're expecting him to go to school and to spell out all these words, and he's going to come home, and he's going to have the paper, and it's going to say 100% A+, great job, Avery. And so Thursday afternoon comes around, and he gets off the bus, and he has this paper, and he brings it to Erica, and it says 30% F. Good job. And we see that, and we're wondering, first off, we thought he knew it all. We thought he knew all these words, but second off, why is the teacher telling him good job? It's not really that great of a job. He got 3 out of 10 right. He missed 7 of them. And we think, well, maybe she's just made some sort of mistake. Maybe she accidentally wrote on this paper, meant to write on another paper, and so we think, all right, we just don't think any more about it. We move on to the next week, and the next week we think, all right, Avery's going to have to do better this week. And so we study with him, and we make sure we know him. We send him off to school on Thursday, and we know for sure that he knows all 10 of those words. And we expect that there's just absolutely no way that he can fail. And so he goes to school, he takes the test, and he comes home. Once again, he only got 3 out of 10 right. And it says 30% F. Good job. And so this time we're thinking, well, she meant to write it, but why is she writing good job on this? And so we test it one more week, and we send him to school. I mean, we have studied, and we've done everything short of writing the words on his arm for him to make sure that he gets a 100% on this test. And he goes to school, and he takes the test, and he comes home, and he has a 30% F. And the teacher wrote, "Good job." Finally, we call the teacher and we say, "Can we," and bear in mind, this is a made-up story. We call the teacher and we say, "Mrs. Loomis, can we meet with you? We want to talk to you about Avery's test scores and why he's doing so poorly, but on top of that, why are you encouraging him by saying good job?" And so we go and we meet with her and we say, "Listen, we just don't understand. We thought that he knew these words, that we were certain when he left for school on Thursday morning, he knew all the words. And when he comes home, he has a 30% and he's getting an F, and it's just not that great, but you're telling him good job. Why are you telling him good job?" And she looks at us and she says, "What is a good job?" Because you see, all the other students only got 20%. He did better than all the other students. And we're confused by that. We don't want Avery to do just simply better than all the other students, because ultimately they're first graders. And if first graders are trying to teach first graders how to do things, and all that Avery's trying to do is just be slightly better than the other first graders, then they're never going to make it to second grade. They're never going to get any better. We don't send Avery to school to be better than the other students. We send Avery to school to learn to follow the teachings of the teacher. And what I want us to think about is how often in our spiritual lives do we get caught looking at everyone else around us and finding ourselves content if we can just find a way to be better than everybody else, but not actually try to become like the teacher. You see, here's the issue that happens with that. When you are trying to be better than somebody else, sometimes it's a lot easier to try to make them look worse than to try to make yourself look better, to try to step up your game. Jesus tells this parable. He says, "Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be better than all the other students," right? No. This student will not be above the teacher, but rather everyone who is fully trained will then be like their teacher. You see, Jesus tells this parable, and his point is, your job is not to be better than everybody else around you. My job is not to be better than you. Your job is not to be better than me. You know why? Because I'm not that good. And if you're better than me, you really haven't gone that far. And the same thing goes, if I'm better than you, no offense, I haven't gone that far. Jesus is not calling us to be better than the people around us. Jesus is calling us to become like the teacher. What does that look like? You see, a few verses earlier, Jesus had had preached this message. He said, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you." When Jesus is calling us to become more like the teacher, he's calling us to change the world and the way that we live, because that's what Jesus was doing. Jesus came not to pronounce judgment, but rather to offer grace so that we don't lose out on that judgment day. Jesus came to offer mercy and to pull people away from their sins, to pull them closer to the teacher. And Jesus calls us to do the same thing. You see, even a verse before that, in verse 36, he told them to be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. You see, Jesus doesn't call us to cast stones on the people around us so that suddenly we can climb up on top of that pile and be better than they are. Instead, Jesus calls us to heap blessings on people. And so after this parable, he tells this story. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye?" He says, how is it that you can look at your brother and you can notice the sin in his life, and you can try to to fix him and try to call that out and try to call attention to the sin in his life, but yet you're not dealing with the sin in your own life. And see, here's why I think we do that sometimes. We do that because if we can call out the sin in somebody else's life and bring them a little bit lower, we actually don't have to move. If we can get them below us, we feel pretty good. But we're not called to bring everybody lower, but rather we're called to live to something higher. And not just that, but to take people with us. You see, it's a lot easier to pull people down than it is to pull people up. But Jesus didn't call us to do the easy thing. Jesus called us to live to this higher calling. And so in the latter part of verse 42, he says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." He told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the pit? Can one sinner lead another sinner? Can one person whose life is full of sin lead another person whose life is full of sin? Can the person with a plank in his eye fix the guy with the sawdust in his eye? No, they're both going to fall into the pit. He said the student's not above the teacher. We're not called to be above the teacher. We're not called to be above the other students, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. We're called to become like the teacher. You see, here's what Jesus is telling us to do. It's what Paul wrote to Timothy to do. He's not calling us to train ourselves to be better than everyone else. He's not calling us to train ourselves to just simply be a little bit better than what we were the day before. He is calling us to train ourselves to be like God. Train yourself to be godly. How do we do that? How do we train ourselves to be godly? In Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, Paul wrote to the church there, and he wrote, "Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." And he says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature." When Jesus is calling us to become like the teacher, when Paul is telling us to train ourselves to be godly, he's telling us to set our minds on something greater than what we see in this world around us. You see, if I'm training myself to become better than you, my sights aren't set high enough. And if you are training yourself to become better than me, your sights just aren't set high enough. Because still we're focusing on earthly things. And honestly, when we do that, we usually don't actually try to become better than somebody. We just generally try to make them worse than we are. And so he tells them to put to death whatever belongs to their earthly nature and to start training yourself for something higher, for something godly. So how do we do that? Well, he kind of tells us within this little message that he gives us. He says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." He gives us the first step. He says, remove the plank from your own eye. You see, somebody pointed out this to me recently, is that, and I purposely put this in from the New International Version so we could see this a little bit better, is that it talks about it being a speck of sawdust versus being a plank. What's a plank made out of? It's going to be wood. The speck in the brother's eye that he's talking about is made out of the same material that's in our own eyes. And see, here's why I think sometimes it's become so easy for us to notice the speck in somebody else's eye and ignore the plank in our eye. It's because we're seeing what we are projecting on them. We're seeing our own sin. We're seeing the things that we're used to seeing. I used this illustration a couple weeks ago. It's like when you buy a car and you think, nobody has this car. This is great. I'm going to be the only one on the road driving this car. You buy the car, you go on the road, and suddenly everybody drives that car. It's not that they didn't drive it before. It's that now you've learned to notice it. It's evident in your life, and so it's becoming evident in everybody else's life. And I think the same thing can happen with our sins sometimes. Sometimes it's easier to call out somebody else's sins because ultimately they're the same sins we're dealing with. But we want to fix them instead of ourselves. And so he tells us first to remove the plank from your own eye. Fix yourself first. He says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. You see, I think the second thing he tells us is to, after you have removed that plank from your eye, look back at your brother and make sure that that speck is still there. Because here's the other thing that I think happens sometimes. Sometimes we notice it because it's there, and it's what we're dealing with also, and sometimes we notice it because it's not there, and we're just, like I said, we're projecting it on them. You see, I've got an uncle, and he dresses nice, especially Sunday mornings, and he's used to be a preacher. He's a retired preacher now, and it used to be that as people came back to him, they'd shake his hand, and they'd say, Chris, you look nice today. That's why I dressed like this today. You're free to tell me I look nice today. It's all right. They'd say, Chris, you look real nice today. And his comment to them every single time was, that's just the reflection of you in my eyes. I thought that's pretty smooth. But you see, we tend to see ourselves reflecting off other people at times, don't we? And I wonder if sometimes the reason that we are seeing the speck in somebody else's eye is not because they have a speck in their eye, but because we're seeing a reflection of ourselves there. We're projecting it on them, and yet it's actually in ourselves. And so he says, take the plank out of your eye, then you will see clearly. So make sure the speck's still there. But then if it's still there, he says, remove the speck from your brother's eye. Open their eyes. Here's what I want to say. Open their eyes to the teacher. You see, it changes everything if we've gone through this process. If I'm walking around with a plank in my eye and I'm trying to fix the speck in your eye, why are you going to trust me to do that? Why are you going to feel like I'm treating you with love and mercy and grace like Jesus has just called all of his followers to treat others like? You're not, because I'm acting like a hypocrite. But you see, when we go through the process of removing the plank from our own eye, and then use that as a way to help others remove the specks from their eyes, you ever tried to remove a sin from your life? It's not an easy process, is it? Sin is, boy, it's a tough stain, isn't it? And it's hard to get out of those things that pull us down. But if we can work on ourselves and learn the teachings of the teacher and try to become more like the teacher and get rid of the sin that we're dealing with, then if somebody else is still dealing with that sin, if they still have that speck in their eye, and I think oftentimes we try to use this verse to say, listen, you can't talk to me about my sin. You've got your own sins. I don't think that's what Jesus says here. Jesus does call us to hold each other accountable. That's part of being the body of Christ, is not to fix everybody necessarily, but rather to pull each other up to a higher calling, to become more like the teacher. You see, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, I think it is, he says, imitate me because I'm so good to imitate, right? No, he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Paul was calling people to follow him as he had removed so many things from his past, and he's now pressing forward towards the goal. He's telling people to follow him, not because he's so great, but because he has now found the way to the teacher. And he's calling them to be fully trained like the teacher. And see, if we can begin to relate to people as to what it's like to deal with sin, not to push them down, not to heap stones upon them, but to begin to call them to something greater, to begin to ask them to walk the path that we've had to walk ourselves, to become more like the teacher, then we are better suited to call each other to that accountability. You see, here's what Jesus said. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will what? Be like their teacher. See, here's the message that Jesus is calling his disciples to as he preaches this Sermon on the Mount. He has been telling them to live so much differently from the world. He tells them to go out and to love their enemies. He tells them to go out and go the second mile with somebody. He tells them to go out and give their cloak to people. He tells them to take care of the poor and the needy. He tells them to change the world by reaching out to the people that nobody else would reach out to. And he preaches this in Luke chapter 6. You know what happens in Luke chapter 7? Luke chapter 7, we just spoke about it last week. Jesus goes out and he heals the centurion. Jesus goes out and he does, or not the centurion, he heals the centurion's servant. Jesus goes out and he does everything that he's just been preaching about. He says, I'm not just going to tell you to do it, I'm going to show you how to do it. And if we can realize that we're not above the teacher, we're not above each other, but we're just trying to become like the teacher, then when we're fully trained, we'll go out and we'll do the things that Jesus does. He calls us to be like the teacher. You see, here's what he says. I want you to notice that the wording that he uses. He says, but love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be what? Children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. He uses wording like children and father and student and teacher. He calls us to follow the Father. And he tells us that we are children of the Father. You know what I've noticed about fathers and their children? Lots of times they look a little bit alike. People tell me Avery kind of looks like me. You've probably heard the same thing about you and your parents, that you look like your parents, or maybe your children look like you. It's because we are becoming like our parents, whether we want to admit it or not. That's a scary thought sometimes. But we become like our parents. Jesus is calling us not to become like our brothers, not to become like the world, not to become like the other students. He's calling us to become like the Father. He's calling us to become like the teacher. He's calling us to become like himself. You see, way back in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, we read this incredible verse. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. You see, we have been called not to be better than everybody else. We've been called to be the image of God in this world. And that's what Jesus is telling his disciples in this Sermon on the Mount, is that this world doesn't know what the image of God is like. And that's kind of part of what Dad was talking about in his communion comments. That's part of what we talked about in our class this morning, is that this world had no idea what to expect when Jesus came. They don't know what the image of God is to look like because they have an idea of what they think the image of God should look like. And Jesus tells us it's something completely different from the world. But he still calls us to go out and be that image. Train yourself to be godly. I think it was the New American Standard version that says, discipline yourself for godliness, for godlikeness. We have been called to be like God. Think about that. Think about that. We are never going to reach that point. But because we're never going to reach that point, it means that we're always stepping forward. There's never room for us to be looking backwards and stepping backwards. There's never room for us to push other people backwards. There's never room for us to heap stones on one another, but only room for us to call each other forward, to become like God. The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. You see, here's what I think he's calling us to do. I think this is my last slide. Let me make sure. Okay. So yeah, here's what I think he is calling us to do. He's calling us to be like the teacher. And he shows us how to do that. He tells us how to do that by telling us this story about a guy that has a big old log in his eye, worrying about the guy who has a speck of sawdust in his eye. And you know what I've noticed? The speck of sawdust was made out of wood. The log was made out of wood. and as we have the log in our own eye. Jesus is not calling us to be the housekeepers with the dust rag getting rid of the sawdust. Jesus is calling us to be the committed disciples who are pushing their way towards what Jesus was pushing his way towards. Calling us to something greater, because he doesn't call us to worry about the speck of sawdust. He doesn't call us to worry about the plank. He calls us to worry about the cross. He calls us to aim for the cross, to get rid of the sawdust, to get rid of the speck, to get rid of the plank, not so that we can stay where we are, but so we can start walking forward in self-denial, in absolute committed laying down our life for Jesus. When we can learn to do that, here's what I think the entire message of the Sermon on the Mount was. When we can do that, we can stick out from the world. And we can change the world like Jesus changed the world. But you know where it starts in changing the world? You see, we have politicians, and they make us all these promises about how they're going to change the world. And why do we vote for these politicians? It's because we see them saying they're going to change the world, but we vote for the ones who say they're going to change the world around us but allow us to stay the same way that we are, right? You see, nobody voted for Donald Trump when he said, "Make America great again," because they wanted Donald Trump to change who they were. Right? We only vote for the people who will let us stay who we are and change the world around us. Jesus isn't calling us to that, is he? Jesus isn't calling us to just make the world better by changing the world around us. You see, the first step that Jesus gave us in changing the world, remove the plank. Change yourself. Call yourself to something higher. Be the student who looks to become like the teacher. And when we become like the teacher, when we become fully trained and we begin looking like the teacher, then we can start calling others to look like the teacher also. But when we begin to do that, I don't think we're actually going to have to call others. I don't think there's going to be as many specks to remove as we think there might be. Because I think that in the way that we live our lives, as the body of Christ looks at us, as the way that we live our lives, and people look at us and they see us becoming more like Jesus, I think they're going to start removing the specks from their own eyes, aren't they? And they're going to start wanting to look like Jesus also. You see, Jesus didn't call us to be better than everyone around us. Jesus called us to be like Jesus. And so this morning, we want to offer an invitation. An invitation for you to take the first step right now and start your walk into becoming like Jesus. Don't worry about everybody else, but look at yourself first. And ask yourself, as a student, am I becoming like the teacher? And so if we can help you this morning, if you need to put Christ on in baptism and allow for his blood to cover you, his grace to cover you, so that you can experience his grace for you to then extend to everybody else, we're here to help you with that. If you need prayers, whatever it might be, we ask that you give your life to the teacher and start training to become like him. So if we can help you in any way, if you need prayers, we've got elders in the back, you can come forward, whatever it might be, come forward now as we stand and as we sing.